All right, welcome to today's video. Today we're going to move into CSS3, our cascading style sheets, and this is going to piggyback from our conversation on HTML5. Again, introductory, and so what we're trying to establish is a fundamental understanding of how CSS interacts with HTML. Remember, HTML is responsible for the structural layout, and CSS really applies the styles or the properties or the instructions on how the browser is supposed to make these elements look. The last piece in the client-side stack that we'll start talking about here later in the semester then is JavaScript, and then we'll have a pretty solid understanding of everything that works on the client side, that is, in the browser itself. So what is CSS? That's an acronym that stands for Cascading Style Sheet. This is what what is provided to the page with the instructions that specifies how each element on that page is supposed to appear. There are previous versions of CSS3. CSS3 is the latest standard. Previous versions were CSS2, 2.1, and 1. And so with that, we have these compatibility issues. And hopefully, especially if you've never worked on the web space before, you're starting to see a little bit of a trend or a little bit of a pattern of all these different standards, HTML5, and we'll see it with JavaScript as well. And that browsers are able to adopt or generate their own standards or their own interpretation thereof. And so we do have some compatibility issues with that, and we'll point some of those out as we go. How does CSS look? I think probably the easiest way to start understanding CSS is just simply to start looking at the syntax and then doing some examples or some demos, which we'll do later on here. This is the general rule, the general syntax for a CSS style rule. We have the selector. So what this selector is telling the browser is to identify the elements, the tags in which we want these properties to apply. So we define a selector, we use curly brackets, and then we define properties within those curly brackets. So anything that matches the selector will have these properties applied. Okay, and as we look at CSS, you're going to see this particular the syntax repeated over and over again. It's very important to start understanding how these selectors work. One, because we want to be able to effectively apply our CSS, and two, because we have a broader applicability with these. When we start talking about the DOM and looking at JavaScript and doing dynamic things on the client side, we'll write the exact same selectors, and we'll be able to use this, our ability to determine what selectors will give us what elements over and over again. Right, so we have what's called the Style Cascade, and there are multiple levels, multiple layers, multiple places in which we can create those style rules, those rules that we just looked at. To me, this diagram, although I think it's pretty good, it's a little upside down in my world, but we get the point across. It gets the point across all the same. We start with, and all of our browsers have built into it an internal style sheet. That's where when we create elements and we view those on a page in a browser and we haven't defined any CSS, that's where those default styles come from, is from within our browser itself. From there, we go down this cascade effect. Right, this is the broadest level, and what we need to understand from this conversation right now is that each layer gets lower, it can override the layer above. That is, that our rules, our CSS rules, can be overridden by these lower layers, and that's how we get that cascade effect. So we start with the browser. We need to have a default set, and that's what the browser defines. We can have user defined. That means that within your browser, you can go and override that internal style sheet of the browser, which is relatively uncommon because then whatever you do there, it only applies to your browser. As a developer, the next level that we typically go to then, and this is the dominant level in which we write CSS, is an external style sheet. And we'll go through the process of linking external style sheets to our documents. Almost all the pages that you visit, the vast majority of the rules written for those pages are going to come from external style sheets. From there, we have embedded style sheets. So we're going to be able to write those rules directly within the document, and then we're going to have something called an inline style, which is going to be an attribute on an HTML element, on one of those tags, in which we define the styles directly on that element. Right? And so the closer we get, as a general rule, the closer that we get the styles, the closer that our style is being defined, the closer they get to the element, the lower, or I guess the higher their precedence, right? So an inline style would override everything else. An author style sheet will override the browser style sheet, but it will be overridden by an inline style, right? And so this is that cascade effect. We have to be aware of that because we have to determine then, as we're defining our styles, we're creating these rules where the appropriate place is. And in general, the most appropriate place is going to be an external style sheet, although we're going to look at all the levels. All right, here's just an example of how you can go into, I'm not even sure what browser that is, a screenshot from. You can go in and potentially look for or override the style sheet by your browser. I just wanted to point out that it's a capability, although it's very uncommon. Oh, there it is. It says the style sheet in Safari. Very uncommon from a developer perspective because we can't do this. As a developer, we can't enforce this. We enforce our styles through external style sheets, inline styles, and then the document level styles. All right, so we'll go through each one of those here real quick and just how do we include those in our pages. The first is the link to the external style sheet. And so here you can see that we're going to use a link tag, and we're going to have to define attributes. These attributes then, key value pairs, we talked about those when we introduced HTML. The href is the link to the style sheet itself. Right? So this document here is looking for a style sheet, something with a .css suffix or extension with the name of SA_layout in the same directory that this file is located in. We also have these additional two attributes that further define what this link is linking to, or the type of content or resource that this link is linking to. Rel equals style sheet and type equals text/CSS, right? We write this external style sheet. I'll show you an example, a very basic example of that here shortly. We write the rules just like we do anywhere else. And all the browser does, and why we care about this, one, is it provides us ability to have greater organization in our style sheets, and two, it operates then at this level. Right? These are the author's external style sheets. Right? So we can create these files, and then we can link these files into all of our pages because we simply, for any page that wants to use these styles, we just simply have to create a link to it. Put this in the head section and link to it. Right? Embedded style sheets are some that you can put within the document itself. And so the opposite of our external, because these live in a file that's independent. That means any page, any web page in our site can use them. These are embedded within the document themselves. That means that only that document, only that page has access to these styles. These also come at a greater priority, or they're lower on that cascade. And so any styles defined at this level will override that external style sheet as well as the browser defined. These are typically done in the head section again, and I'll show you an example of doing that. On top of the browser cascade, we also have to be aware of the order in which we define our style sheets, and that is that style sheets are going to be processed by the browser, and then as it processes additional style sheets or additional rules, it can override those previous rules. So much like the cascade effect, we can override simply by having a style sheet included later in the process of the browser loading the document. And that'll probably become more clear once we get into the DOM and start working a little bit more with the HTML. Hopefully if that's a little confusing right now, that's okay, because we'll talk more about it when we have more examples here. Okay, the last level is the inline style itself. Inline being that we've defined the style rule directly on the element itself. And so here's an example of doing that, in which we have our element, we have our tag, and then we use this style attribute with a list of properties. Right, and then that's applied directly on this element. This is the lowest. This has the highest precedence. This overrides everything. And so if you define styles on this element, in order to change them, you have to come back to this code, and delete them or modify them or change them. So again, the CSS, the Cascading Style Sheet, gives us it allows us to write rules that we can broadly apply against many pages. When we define them on a style inline like this, then it only applies to this element. And if we want to change that, we have to come into our code and change this attribute and this attribute values. Whereas with CSS, we can change that CSS rule in that CSS document, and then it'll apply to whatever selectors, whatever selector, the elements that the selector selects. All right, so I've talked a little bit about that. As a general rule, the more specific style is applied instead of the more general. So we're talking about not only the hierarchy in which we include the style rules, but also as we go from broad rules to more specific rules. And what that means is that we have this, we have the ability to say something very broad, like body. We know body is a very broad element because it's the parent-most element for all of for all the other elements that make up our user interface. So we could say that the body is a color blue, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of these properties here in just a moment. So that means everything on this page, the font would have a color of blue, unless we supplied a more specific rule. So then we could say, well, the paragraphs inside of our body or the headers inside of our body have a different color. And then we begin to override because those become more specific, as these are relatively more broad. That is, so not only do we have that general rule, but then we also have, it's known as a concept of style inheritance. So we have a couple of different things, that we have to understand in order to effectively write rules. That is, we have to understand where we define that rule. It's the browser, it's the external style sheet, it's within the document, or it's inline. And then we also have to determine how we write those selectors themselves. This is an example then of a selector, this being very broad because we're selecting everything inside of the body. Right, so we'll get more practice with that. The goal of the course is not to become experts or masters of HTML or CSS. It's to get a broad understanding of how modern web applications are developed. So don't get too concerned if some of this is not quite clicking yet. Comments, you will see as you start looking at CSS, you will start to see plenty of comments in the documents. Comments will be in this format, /*, **, and this defines what's called a block level comment. That means the comment can span multiple lines. Anything between these two characters is then not interpreted by the browser as a style rule or a potential style rule, but simply a comment, so it ignores this space. This is the only comment character in CSS, and so oftentimes you'll find authors will leave their comments in there to define sections of the CSS document or just leave notes behind. We want to use these comments relatively sparingly. We want to use them in order to add clarity to our documentation or to our CSS, but not to clutter it up with comments or narratives or anything else like that. Okay, to get a handle on what we do, so we talked a little bit about just the general syntax. We have two components then. We have to talk about the selector itself, how do we create selectors, and then what are the properties that we use. We'll start off here just looking at a few properties, and in particular, because color is one of the dominant properties that we want to work with, we'll look at a couple different ways in which we can represent color in CSS. Two of the most common are going to be in this format, RGB, parentheses, and then a red value, a green value, and a blue value. These values are going to be a number represented from 0 to 255. 0, so if I had RGB 000, that means we'd have no color. It'd be black. If I had a RGB value of 255, 255, 255, then we'd have all of the three primary colors, and we'd have a value of white. Combinations then thereof determine what color we get. If I wanted all red, I would say 255, 0, and 0. If I wanted green, 0, 255, and 0. And we just start mixing and matching those color values to get the desired color that we want. As developers, we often get this color information from the designer. We're working off of a mock-up, we're working off of some sort of a layout that says this is the kind of site that we want to build, and so we don't oftentimes have to figure this out on our own. We have to figure out the color value, but it's oftentimes provided to us from the designer. The other method in which colors are represented are through this hashtag and then red, green, and blue. And so these are two hexadecimal digits, hexadecimal numbers, representing really the same values here. 0 to 255, 0 to 255, 0 to 255, except it's represented in hex. And so we'd have 000000 for black, FF, FF, FF for white. And here's a diagram that represents that. Although I think at one point in time, this diagram gets off. Yeah, I think it's right here on this column, on these right-hand columns. So ignore from purple on because the authors, and I just caught this, I apologize, I didn't just get rid of this diagram, but they made a mistake here, and then something happened to this diagram here. So these aren't quite right. So RGB, let's say we want black, 000, we talked about that. Let's say we want blue, 00255. The hexadecimal version of that would be 0000FF. right? What is 255 represented at hex? FF, right? And so we can look at these different values, 128, 128, 128, written as an RGB triplet, 808080, written as hexadecimal. Right, a lot of converters online, and you can do it with your calculator as well. And so as you start working with these colors, if you're not really sure, plenty of places out there to go and help you transfer between a normal color name like this and its RGB or hexadecimal value. Okay, so how do we use that color property or those color values? Well, then we have two properties that we define within our CSS called background-color and color. And these two properties define what the background color is and what the foreground color is. So background color would be the background, and then foreground would be this color value or the property, which would be like our text. We then use for the value, so here where it says color, we then use the hexadecimal notation or that RGB value. And so we'll take a look at that real quick. I've uploaded into our document, into our class folder, this document right here. This lays out a very basic HTML document with some of those basic sectional kind of layout elements that we've been talking about. So here's our body, here's header, here's section, here's a footer, and then each one of these has some additional HTML elements inside of it, some header tags, an unordered list with some list items, content inside of a section. Okay, and so what we can do is I'm not gonna look at the external style sheet quite yet because we need to go through the process of setting up a website, much like we did with WordPress and Drupal. And so we'll go through that in a later video. What I'm going to do is define the styles within the document itself, just to keep everything contained right now in this one particular document. So we can start with a very broad rule. Let's say that this is my selector. Okay, selector is body, and I want to say that the color is let's do red, green, let's do blue. So I could say hashtag RGB, so 00 for red, 00 for green, and FF for blue. All right, that would be equivalent to saying with an RGB value of 00255. Okay, and now what we'll get when we look at this document is that all the color on our site, all this text will be blue. Right, so we can look at this just by double-clicking that file, CSS intro, and it should open up in the browser. There it is, right? Everything's blue. So we overrode the default style from the browser, which would have made that black. Okay, this is our selector. Right. Well, let's say that we want to make the content inside of this paragraph tag, let's say they want to make that green. So we could write an additional selector. I could say paragraph, color, hashtag, red, green, blue. Okay, this is pretty broad. This is a little bit more specific. And so we'll have the style inheritance occur because that paragraph is more specific than that body, right? So this content is now green where everything else remains blue, right? This is our selector, and then this is the style. These are the attributes for that particular, the particular elements that were selected. Let's say that I want to additionally make that background color red. Right? We can write the word red, but oftentimes you're going to see it written like this. So FF0000. And we'll go back to our page, and we'll see that the background color is now red, and the foreground color is green. Right. So this is the basis behind CSS: selector, and then the properties. Okay, and we have all these properties here, and we'll start to explore those as we go throughout the course. Okay, so that's just a couple. We do have some enhancements, some of the things that make CSS3 CSS3. Just like with HTML5, there are additional features or benefits, and these are some of the compatibility issues. And so RGBA is one. A stands for the alpha channel, which is opacity. And so we can define, if we use RGBA, we can, just like we did before, the red component, the green component, the blue component, and then we can determine how opaque that is, how transparent it is. And so we can make a small modification. Let's say that I go back here, and instead of using that hex notation, I say RGBA, I can say red, green, blue, and then the value here is between 0 and 1.0 on how transparent we want it to be. So I could say 0.5 for about a half transparency, and go back to the content, to the site here. Oops. Forgot my semicolon, right? Simple syntax error. Go back here and, right, it's very subtle, but you can see that that green doesn't stand out quite as much because it's half transparent, and so it's letting some of that background color bleed through. Right, so that is important when you need to work with transparencies. Right, so we have a couple of different options there. All right, here's just an example of that. Again, it's a little hard to see in this slide, but this color is white, 255, 255, 255, but it allows a little bit of that background color to bleed through. And maybe I'll be able to replicate that here by saying these are all white, so I'll make the color of that paragraph text white, but I'll have that half of it be, right, so you can see that's definitely not white. 0, 0, 0, 0, yep, definitely not white. So 0.1, I can see what that gives us. Okay, that's almost completely bled through. Well, and a 0.9, which means it's almost completely, and there we go. Oh, I'm sorry, that's not white, that's black. 0 is all black. So let's do 255 values. That gives us white. And there we go. It's almost completely white, almost no transparency. So 1.0 would be no transparency. 0.1 would almost be completely transparent. And now you can see, we can hardly see that text. It's still there, but we can hardly see that. And so values in between allow for varying degrees of opacity. Right, and there we go, a little bit more, not completely white. All right, so we just looked at contextual selectors, and that becomes the key to understanding how to select content, how to select elements, and how to write the rules then for your CSS. There is a hierarchy, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about the DOM, the hierarchy of our elements. I mentioned that when we introduced HTML, that we have body tag, and every element inside of the body is a child of that body. Every element then has a parent that is the body. And we have that hierarchical relationship throughout the entire HTML document. Parents, siblings, descendants, and child. We can look at that as we look at this document here. Header is a descendant or a sibling of, not a sibling, but a child of body. Inside of the section header, H1, paragraph, UL, they all have the same parent. That means that all of these elements are siblings, right? And so we have this hierarchical relationship between all of these elements that determine how, in part anyway, how we write our selectors. Okay, syntax. We have a variety of ways in which we can write the syntax. If you look at this diagram here, you can see that we have this different grouping elements. And so we're going to start off with very, very basic selectors, but the selectors can get very complex. We can get more than one selector per rule. And so let's go back to this example here. Let's say that I have inside of my footer, let's say I have an additional paragraph tag. So we'll call this our footer content, right? And now if I have that in this, if I have this content in the footer, this is a paragraph, and I have a rule right now that's written for that paragraph that will make all paragraph text green. And if I refresh this page, let's get rid of that background color, and let's go ahead and make this green again. Okay, there we go. All right, so that makes all of our paragraph, all the content, that foreground color for every paragraph green. Well, let's say that I don't want that. Let's just say that I want to have the paragraph inside of this section green. Okay, well, we can change our selector. We can say something like section paragraph, and that will match. So that selector says that it will apply these rules, these properties to all paragraph tags that have as a parent a section tag. right? If we look at this paragraph tag, it has as a parent footer and then body. So it wouldn't apply. This rule would not select, it would not be true when trying to select this paragraph. This paragraph has as its parent a section, right? And it's almost like the body is implied. This is in case this would be true. In this case, it would be true. And so now if we go back and look at this page, we can refresh that and you can see that rule applies only to that section, right? So that's how we determine how we start to combine multiple selectors to be more precise in how we apply our rules. All right, we can also select off of attributes, and two of the most common attributes that you'll be selecting off of are ID and class, right? So when we talked about attributes, we can define attributes on any of our elements like this. Attributes are a key value pair. It's a property defined at the element level, and this is an example of doing that. And so we can select off of those attributes, right? So let's say that we want to make this text here a gray color. Right, so we can create a selector, we can create a rule, and we can say that our selector is, we use the hashtag to denote that we're going to select based off of ID, and because this has an ID value of copyright, we could say hashtag copyright, and we'll make that color, let's see, we'll do that. Okay, all right. Let's see if that works. So we'll refresh our page, and if our selector is correct, that text right there will turn into a gray color. Okay, a gray or a black, I guess. That works. We could go back and I could change that. This might look a little bit better. I think CC will do that. So we'll go back here. Yeah, that's pretty light, but you can see that it did in fact change. Right? This is my selector. This says look for any element that has an ID attribute value equal to copyright. So what this is looking for is an ID equals copyright, which we have right down here. This attribute copyright. All right, classes are the other one. All right, and classes are, let's do a class here. Class is an attribute, so we can say class equals, and we'll say header title, just to give it a somewhat descriptive class name. How we define a class then is we use a period in front. So we say period header title, and we'll say the color for this should be yellow. Right? So when we define a class, as a rule, we use the dot, so dot and then the name of that class, and then how we apply that attribute. Because remember, these are two ways. Let me add this comment in here. Where we're selectors based off of attributes. Okay, so these are two ways. So hashtag is the ID attribute, the dot represents the class attribute. So we can say class equals header title. Right? And now when we refresh this page, we should see that our header title is now yellow, in which case it is. Right? So we're defining these additional rules by selectors that become more specific, to target specific elements within our document. And that's the basis, that's the foundation, that's what we do with our style sheets. Okay, again, a lot of selectors. And so you can look at all these. These are just an example to help get started. There's the class. We can do element.class. We can combine these. We can take selectors and say things like, well, I want any element that has a class attribute value equal to header title that has a parent as a header element. Right? That would still apply right here. We'd see no change. But the idea here is, or the example, the purpose of me saying that is that we can combine those. You can combine these selectors to get very precise in what elements are selected. Right? So here's a lot of examples. We can select by different attributes, by a different. Well, I'll let you read through those because there's a lot of examples here that get just slightly more complex, but give us greater control over our rules and what the elements they select are. Okay, font families, and the font families are another big one that you'll work with, kind of that one of those core properties that you need to get familiar with, because the font has a pretty big impact in the overall look and feel of the site. And it's one of the things that a designer, when they're helping to develop a site, they usually go through great pains to ensure they select the correct font style. There are two types of fonts we're going to look at. For the first one, we're going to look at fonts that are supported by the browser, because websites are just becoming more popular, or well, they have been pretty popular for quite a while now, our demand for a greater set of font families has increased. And so with CSS3, there's a font face rule that we can define. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on when we get into more advanced CSS stuff, in which we can define fonts that the browser simply doesn't support, right? So the browser has a default set that it supports, and there's all these other fonts that we like to use that we can include in our style sheets and use as kind of outside of that browser support. So the primary rule, or the primary property, is font-family, and then the fonts as you want to define them. Here's a bunch of WebSafe fonts. So these are ones that most browsers support, so they're safe to use. Arial Black, Century Gothic, Comic Sans, Courier New, whatever. You'll typically see, when somebody defines the font family, you'll typically see that defined within the body tag, because we want these to apply to all fonts within the site itself. So I could say sans serif, comma, Comic Sans. I think that'll work. Times New Roman. We'll see if that works. We can define those families. We can refresh our page, and you'll see here that my font changed, right? And so what we have is this list of supported fonts based off of a list like this, and then it's comma separated. And so what we're saying to the browser is, I prefer that you use this one. If you don't have that font, if you don't understand that, then use this one. And if you don't understand that one, then you do a comma and you just keep going. Eventually, if the browser doesn't understand any of the fonts that you want to use, it just uses the default browser style sheet font family. So eventually it runs out and it just uses something that it understands, right? If you use these WebSafe fonts, then you typically don't run into that issue, because typically all browsers support these basic WebSafe fonts. That's why they're safe to use in the web. Okay, additional font properties, font family. We just talked about that. We have the font size. Font size, then you determine by setting the number. We'll talk about measurement units a little bit later on. So you can say font family, and we want everything to be 30 pixels. All right, if we go back and look at that. That's not what font size. I got to use the right property. You'll see that it changes drastically the font size here. Right, it makes everything bigger. Right, so we'll talk about units of measure, px for pixel and em for a different size unit, a relative unit measurement. But it's a basic property in which we define the font size. We can define it body. We can define it for any rule that we write. So if we want the text in here to be bigger, smaller, whatever, we can define that font size and change that characteristics of that content. Font style, font weight. Right, so additional properties. We won't go through a sample here. Font style, normal, italic, oblique. Font weight, normal, bold, bolder, light, lighter. Right, so we can just change the appearance of the font using these different properties. Decoration, underline, overline, line through, text transform, capitalize, uppercase, lowercase, or none. So uppercase will be your proper case. Font variant, type, normal, small caps. Right, so a lot of different settings within the font family of properties. The other element, and we're going to start talking again more and more about elements here as we go. Another element that we'll look at is a list, because lists are pretty important, and that we'll use them not only to display content, but we'll also use them as a structural component. And so here you can see a very basic list that I've defined in this document, UL and OL. So UL is unordered list, and if I define an OL, that's an ordered list. And I'll go ahead and do that real quick. And I'll paste in, just copy and paste these exact same elements over. Okay, we can look at the document then just to see how that looks. Not that one, but this one. Right, so here we have item 1, 2, 3 and item 1, 2, 3. Unordered list, we get bullets. Ordered list, we get an ordering. 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3. So in order. So that makes sense. This is the parent element then for these LIs. These are list items, and so we have to determine what type of list we're going to use, and then these are the elements, the tags that we use for each individual item within that list. Okay, so that's the general format for that. We have a bunch of properties, or a handful of properties anyway, not a bunch, just a couple, that determine what we use for that type. So for an unordered list, and even an ordered list, we can change what that default character is. Normally it's a bullet, or it's 1, 2, 3 through whatever number of list items that we have. But we can change what that is. We can say disk, circle, square, There's a whole bunch of different properties there. And so let's say that I want to change the list right now that is a bullet. Let's say that I want to change that to a square. Well, I would say selector. So let's be a little more precise. I'll say section UL, and I will use the list style type and turn that into a square. All right, now when we go back and refresh, we see that that's no longer a bullet, it's a square. How do you know about all of these? Well, if we go to a place like W3 Schools, and we can just search for that. You can see here all I did was W3 Schools and that property, list style type. That gave me this top hit, and we have, much like information that we've looked at on the past on this site, definition and usage, browser support, which is always important, although this isn't a CSS3 thing, the syntax, and then all the different values. All right, so you can look at this and look at all the different values here. You can see that there's quite a few, as well as some additional examples here. All right, so just another good resource as we're kind of going through the course here and filling out our toolbox or places that we go to look at information for this. You can use an image if you want to define an image. So some of these can be pretty boring as far as just the default style that the browser, the bullet type that the browser supports, and you can define a little image. And a lot of sites will do that so that they can have a more custom look and feel, something that fits in better with the overall theme of the site. Position. We have style position, list style, paddings and margins, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the box model, which is kind of this is the introduction to CSS, and then there's that's part of the next thing that we'll talk about is layout and flow and normal flow and box model. That'll all be important parts that we'll have to cover with CSS, which we will get to. So list style position, right? So where do the markers go? Are they on the inside or the outside? And we start having to make these determinations when we start looking at, we'll have our developer tools, and we'll be able to inspect this element, and we'll look at those individual components like this, and we'll have this box model, which we'll talk about, margin, border, padding, and then the content itself, and the rules, right? Another important area, very important part of our developer tools is our ability to look at how the rules are being applied to our elements. And we can see here that if we hover over this unordered list, we have that content or its box model shows up here. And to the right, where the rules come from. You know, where are the properties being applied? Well, section UL, that comes from my inline styles defined in my document. And what's another nice feature with our developer tools is we can toggle those off. Right? We can interact with that CSS directly in this browser, just to see the kind of changes that we have. It gives us greater control over as we're starting to troubleshoot or determine the rules, make the rules, and create the selectors and the properties that we want to use. Right. So we'll look more at these properties here, or you should spend some time looking at these properties as we're digging more into CSS. All right. Here I can show you quick. What was that? We'll style position. We'll do inside this time. All right, so there you go. Position changed. And what was that effect? Well, we'd have to look at our developer tools, and we can see just how that's changed. This bullet is now a part of, and you can see it a little bit clearer here because of these two lists. Here, the bullet is outside of the content, and here the bullet becomes really a part of that content. Right? So it just changes where that bullet is put. So it all depends on the kind of layout that you want. All right, a little bit longer than I had planned, but there's quite a bit to talk about or introduce with CSS, and so we'll get deeper into it as we start to use it more and we move throughout the semester. Any questions on this, let me know. Please do spend some time, though, looking at this document, writing some rules, and just exploring style sheets. And again, if you have any questions, if I left anything a little too ambiguous or unclear, or we try to tackle too much in this video, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks.